as well as research and academia. We hope that today will be a valuable discussion on what are some very key issues in Zambia right now: mining, prospects for domestic and regional value addition, as well as how to really maximize the benefits coming from trade routes connecting Zambia to regional ports. This workshop is part of an ongoing research project the European Council on Foreign Relations has been undertaking in partnership with the Institute of Economic and Social Research here at the University of Zambia with Edward. This broader research project looks at mining, value addition, and regional integration, both in Namibia and in Zambia. And it's funded by the Africa-Europe Foundation and the European Climate Foundation. As noted on the agenda, the first session will be live streamed as a webinar. We will be welcoming some attendees who will be joining us online. Those who are joining online, please feel free to put some questions in the Q&A box. We will include them in the Q&A session at the end. The second and third sessions will be in-person closed door sessions, and the Chatham House rule will apply to those conversations. So you can talk about the information that was discussed, but not attribute any specific points to specific people. We will also have quite a full agenda today. So to the extent possible, if we could try and stick to time, come back after coffee and lunch sessions quite promptly, that would be really appreciated. And then just one aspect, we will be focusing particularly on Europe's engagement with Zambia. We know that Zambia development partners and investors beyond Europe, this is a particular focus of our work today. And so when you hear Europe being discussed a bit more than others, it's just because of the focus of this project. We do want you to bear in mind considerations with other investors and with other development partners also. Finally, our keynote speaker, Professor Sasa, is not able to join, fortunately. He was called away last minute to go to Addis for a meeting. So we'll be moving into the first session rather than having a keynote speech today. But thank you very much for being here and looking forward to a day of good conversation. Thank you very much. So I will call up the first panel now. The first panel will be looking at, so basically Africa, the crossroads. There's a lot of interest in Zambia and other African countries, critical minerals, but also other sectors. And there've been some new in the Lobito Corridor, as well as the revamping of TAZARA. And so the issues, and also just over the last 2 years, the EU has signed some strategic partnerships with African countries to develop sustainable mineral value chains. So they've been signed with Namibia, with Zambia, with DRC, and with Rwanda. The EU has also signed the for developing the Lobito Corridor. So this is rehabilitating the existing part of the railway line, but also extending it into Zambia. Consider the Lobito Corridor in the context of the other trade routes that exist already in Zambia. So TAZARA, the Nacala route, the Walvis Bay route, and obviously the southern route down to Durban in South Africa. And so just in terms of the corridor, this is a 1,300 line called the Benguela Railway Line that goes from the Lobito port in Angola up to Kolwezi in DRC. We understand that, I mean, the railway has been run for a number of decades. I think it was first completed in the 1930s. But in 2022, it was reconcessioned to a consortium of European companies. So they plan to rehabilitate that existing railway line and extend a part into Zambia. From what I've seen from proposed route maps, it will fork in Luanco in Angola and Zambia from there, going through the Jimbe Customs Port, Solwezi, and down to Chingola. Some maps show it reaching Ndola, but some maps don't. So on that aspect, it's a bit unclear. But I'm sure everyone here has heard some exciting talk about Lobito. But what is it? What are the motivations behind it? Most importantly, what does it mean for Zambia? So this is what we will discuss in this first panel. And let me just call up our panelists now. We have Madalena Procopio, who's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Popo, who's executive director of the Center for Trade Policy and Development. Bindo, who is a logistics specialist with FRC Consulting. Just to come up. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So just to remind everyone, open session, we do have some members of the media here. First, it will be an open conversation. There will be a recording that will be put on the ECFR website, but the later two sessions will be Chatham House. So just to kick off the conversation this morning, maybe turning to you, Madalena, can you outline for us the geopolitical and geo-economic significance of the Lobito Corridor for the EU? How does it fit into the EU's objectives?
Yeah, thank you. I need to use the microphone. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So, for being here. Yes, so just to kickstart immediately, is an Africa-related project, of course, but it's part of the EU's wider efforts to make geopolitical strategies in the face of recent years. And these phenomena are increased disruptions in supply chains. We've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, then the US-China trade war, a rise in protectionist bans on critical resources, the rise of industrial policies, protectionist industrial policies, and so forth. And so the EU has become more concerned about its industrial autonomy as well as energy security. The other macro phenomena is increased fracturing of the global order and a reshuffling of alliances, with the US being a more complicated partner, the BRICS grouping expanding, signaling an increased desire from the global South to have different options to what has long been a Western-led order. All of these pushed Europe to think how to navigate this changing scenario and to identify new partners. Underscoring these two phenomena that I mentioned, there is the energy transition, which is somehow dictating economic and political agendas the worldwide, channeling or rechanneling economic flows in different directions and reshuffling political alliances. Africa, in all of the EU, the European member states realized that they needed a significant overhaul of their policies in all of these to remain somehow globally competitive, both geopolitically and geoeconomically. Africa became all the more important, but in both geopolitical and geoeconomic terms, and the agreement on the Lobito Corridor is somehow evidence of these. Geopolitically, some of the main considerations have been diluting China's influence in Africa and globally. This doesn't mean no talks with China, but diluting its presence and influence. The Lobito Corridor, somehow by positioning itself as a mirroring of the China-built TAZARA railway, which here in Zambia is clearly well known, is an important posturing gesture. Of all the critical infrastructure, cross-regional critical infrastructure that could be chosen, that could be undertaken across the continent, this clearly has a China element. Europe, as I mentioned, is interested in diluting China's influence, but of course it remains to be seen whether that's possible at all. But on top of these more somehow confrontational agenda, there is a slightly more positive agenda that is behind the logic of the Lobito Corridor, which is improving Europe-Africa relations, which have experienced significant strains in recent years. So aiming to work with countries that are, yes, resource rich and so geopolitically relevant, but also out the relationship beyond these natural resources. And the last idea that is important geopolitically speaking, work through multi-stakeholder alliances. The Lobito Corridor is not a bilateral partnership. It includes more partners, and this is important to reduce risks and costs. In terms of geoeconomic reasons, there are A couple of important reasons. One is trade diversification, which of course aligns also with geopolitical motivations. The EU is looking at the moment for alternative trade routes and suppliers to ensure supply chain security and economic resilience. I mentioned during COVID, at the beginning, we didn't have masks in Europe because they were coming from China. And when the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, we needed to diversify the supply from Russia. So the supply chain security and economic resilience is a major priority for Europe at the moment. Securing minerals is also one of the priorities within this trade diversification logic, especially from China, upon which Europe depends significantly. But also increasing trade exchange with Africa, as I mentioned, beyond the mineral sector, beyond the natural resources sector. So by improving logistics and trade routes, the Lobito Corridor can facilitate smoother export and import flows from European markets. The second element of geo-economic importance is the fact that there can be infrastructure investment opportunities. The Lobito Corridor aligns with the EU's Global Gateway Strategy, which was launched 3 years ago, if I'm not wrong, and aims not only to better connect Europe and Africa, Europe and other regions of the world, but Africa occupies an important place in the Global Gateway, but also sees Africa as an opportunity for European companies as they to diversify partners and geographies. So in particular, in sectors like agriculture, energy, and digital. So to conclude here, the initial remarks, the Lobito Corridor critical part of the EU strategy to counterbalance China's influence while enhancing African economic integration as well as Europe-Africa connectivity. And of course, as I mentioned, it remains to be seen whether Europe will actually manage to achieve these objectives, but the logics behind that are largely the ones I just mentioned. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Madalena. Maybe just moving to you, Isaac. There's some concern that the Lobito Corridor development is taking place primarily to facilitate the extraction of minerals from the DRC and from Zambia. However, it could potentially have multi-sector value and broader development impact if it's made available for use beyond the mineral sector. What opportunities do you hope for beyond the mining sector with the extension of the railway into Zambia?
Thank you so much. Indeed, the Lobito Corridor does provide a number of opportunities for a number of countries, especially the countries that are at the center of this development. We have countries like Zambia, DRC, as well as Angola, that stands to hugely get to benefit from this initiative, depending on the strategies that they might put in place. But it also serves as a good opportunity to support efforts around regional integration as per other development initiatives that we have on the continent under the Africa Continental Free Trade Initiative. So this equally can be seen as a stepping stone towards opening up these countries for trade beyond the core programs that are being proposed this far. Indeed, when we look at the way it has been designed, and if we look at the developments that are happening around the world now, one of the key driving factors behind the investment into the Lobito Corridor are the minerals that these countries have, especially Zambia and DRC, in light of the energy transition. But of concern also from the work that we do at the Center for Trade Policy and Development is the form in which these minerals are sought after. For a long time, if you look at these countries that have been mining, if you can just zero it on Zambia, Zambia has been mining for over 100 years. But if you look at the period under which we have been mining, a lot of what has been exploited and extracted minerals that have been exported in raw form. There has been less value addition that would also help to increase opportunities for host countries that do have these minerals. So it would be very important as we have conversations around actualizing an investment opportunity like the Lobito Corridor, to also have conversations that also speak to value addition. It shouldn't be more of an agenda of opening up these countries, taking advantage of the minerals that they might be endowed with, to export these minerals so that they can later be added value in other jurisdictions, and then we get to import the same finished products at prices that might be way higher compared to what our contribution could have been. But it would also be important that along this rail line, we also look at other opportunities that might come with regards to the agriculture sector. In the recent past, Zambia has been investing in providing opportunities for the setting up of multi-facility economic zones. And within these multi-facility economic zones, one of the key push from the government has been to support local manufacturing. More importantly, would be the need for us to start seeing what potentially we can be taking into countries like DRC and Angola. Traditionally, in the DRC, we have been exporting more of mealie meal, and in some cases would export maize. But beyond those traditional crops, what are the other alternatives that we can exploit to export into these countries? And if you look at Angola, Zambia has been having a lot of conversations around considering the importation of oil from Angola, which has not materialized up to now. It would also be important that such is taken into consideration so that the benefits that would come with an investment like that should be mutually beneficial to all the countries that are involved, and we should create a win-win situation.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I'm coming to you, Charles. You have worked on and researched and supported in different ways a number of different trade routes in Africa and their development. And drawing on this regional knowledge, what does your experience of trade corridor development in Africa tell us about what's needed for these initiatives to both serve multi-sector value and be inclusive?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, my colleagues here. Very interesting topic we got here today. And yes, I would like to, in responding to that and the wider conversation, drawing from the experience we've had at the Northern Corridor. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, but with regional work going around Eastern Africa. And also the work we've done across the Central Corridor out of Dar es Salaam and feeding into Zambia, and therefore addressing the logistics, the global shipping fundamentals that need to be in place, both at a primary level and also intra-regional. I'm hearing around conversations around Angola, Zimbabwe, DRC. So the regional space, and then before then we can go into EU, or therefore the global space. Because, ladies and gentlemen, those are fundamentals we must deal with. And especially when we start talking of multi-sectoral. So moving the conversation from mining to other products. How do we ensure that that corridor, that huge infrastructure, the Lobito Corridor opens, is going to have sufficient capacity in the first place without necessarily exporting and refined minerals? Even before we go into value addition, which is critical, like has been mentioned here, logistically, in terms of logistics and the economics of such a huge investment, it is critical for the partner countries, Angola, DRC, and Zambia here, to address capacity issues. Capacity is key. We've had very good experience with the Northern Corridor, where there have been huge investments in capacity. The standard gauge railway coming in about 10 years ago in Kenya, and now connecting Uganda. And yes, you have as a regional bloc, and especially those three countries, address capacity issues. Otherwise, then you're going to have a very expensive railway or infrastructure that you're not utilizing to the optimum. Then now going to the issue of the logistics around value addition. one of the things that we found very beautiful and beneficial, especially for countries that are going to benefit from such a trunk of an investment, is how then do we enable or build capacity of the other economic actors to be able to participate in that trade. And of course, we are not going to export, for instance, technology suddenly from DRC or Zambia into Europe. So outside mining, the next thing is agriculture, isn't it? And it's been mentioned here. So how do we then ensure that there's local capacity to actually contribute to that trade route? And for starters, we are not going to get into that trade just shipping our raw materials. So value addition for agriculture is key. So what we've seen very beneficial is the creation and through government policies of aggregation centers. Aggregation is key because farmers cannot necessarily, it's impossible for farmers at the individual level to contribute or be part of that conversation. So aggregation centers have been very key in making that happen. Special economic zones, multi-factor facilities that have been mentioned by my colleague here, and again, very critical. If you're going to have to create trade with EU, and I've been part of the movement of value-added products out of Eastern Africa, and especially agriculture, because we're not as blessed as you are with minerals. You have to really add value. The countries, governments have to position you as leading in the particular verticals that you supply to those countries. Those countries, again, are very highly regulated, especially in the food chain. So regulation, you don't expect farmers to be able to cope or even scale up quickly to be able to meet those kind of stringent standards. So actors have to come down to the level whereby they build communities, build players to be able to compete in that space. So those are two key things. Now, at the regional level, and I hear a lot of conversation around Zimbabwe. I was speaking to my colleagues here, some of you here, and they were telling me about trade between Malawi, Zimbabwe, Angola, and the challenges that you face. Some of the infrastructure or logistical enablers are fairly basic. For instance, even before we get to the regulatory space, what challenges does a typical truck driver, because the rail will not operate in isolation. Rail has to be fed by road. Road is a key logistical facilitator in Africa. It remains the key. So, and unless the road infrastructure and is developed enough to feed into the roads, so first mile and last mile has to be delivered by road. But what challenges does a typical truck driver who moves cargo from Zambia into DRC face, into Angola and into Zimbabwe? So one-stop border posts, those are some of the initiatives we've seen being very valuable at the logistical side to ensure that trade can move with speed and without a lot of barriers and costs. And then, of course, there is the wider conversation about SADC and the customs union, because tariffs, rules of origin, those will come into play. If you're going to move your products just within the region itself, then you will enable your farmers, you'll enable your communities to value add, even in minerals. But then crossing the border without a common tariff within your countries becomes another very big challenge. And so we've been involved in assisting trading communities or trading blocks actually ensure that they have rules of origin, tariffs that ensure that once goods leave Lusaka heading to DRC, they are not necessarily subjected to customs regulations at the border. The origin rules will come into play. So those are some of the basics that we need to put in place. If obviously in terms of the global shipping, then this environment also has to be opened up for the global players to come in here because you need the intermediaries. You need the intermediaries in global shipping. I think that's a conversation we can have at the second session or outside this, but it's a very wide conversation because those global players are the ones that facilitate international trade. So regional governments have to think, and policy makers have to think about how to make this corridor, which is very ambitious, also attractive to the regional logistics, global logistics players. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take in questions around a lot of work. We've done a lot of work in Eastern Africa, and especially now we're even integrating countries that were fairly seen to be difficult to handle in terms of trade. Somalia is already part of the East African community, and there's a lot of traffic work, a lot of corridor work happening currently to integrate that. South Sudan, a lot of work again going into ensuring that traffic moves within the borders across the interland into South Sudan and outside South Sudan. So thank you very much, and I look forward to further engagement. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Charles. Maybe coming back to you, Isaac, like building on what Charles has outlined, what do you think is needed from the Zambia side to ensure that multi-sector value of the Lobito Corridor? So what strategies, policies, and planning is needed to ensure that other sectors also benefit from this railway infrastructure?
Well, the government of Zambia has already been taking some initiatives. More recently, we've seen the development of the critical minerals strategy, and we've also seen a number of efforts around trying to seek partnerships with other countries like DRC, signing MOUs with hope that they can also set up battery manufacturing plants. Of course, we haven't had further updates beyond those pronouncements in terms of MOUs that were signed, but it is the right steps being undertaken. We've also seen other strategies being developed, such as coming up with some targets in terms of what we want to be producing. We might just need to further enhance our approach. For instance, if we have a clear target in terms of what we want to be producing within the next 6 years, of which the target has been set at 3 million metric tons, we should also have an alternative target in terms of what we hope to be benefiting from the increased production of our minerals. It should not just be a target of what we want to extract and put out on the market. The targets in terms of benefits for the Zambian people equally need to be very clear. Other than that, it would be very important that the government adopts a multifaceted approach. It should not just be a conversation that is happening within the Ministry of Mines. We should also have the Ministry of Agriculture on the table. We should also have the ministry that is in charge of transport and logistics, as well as the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, coming to the discussion table, so that the opportunities that we seek to exploit through opportunities that we are discussing with cooperating partners like the EU, as well as the United cooperating partners, are consolidated and they are speaking to each other. Because we've also seen that, well, you might have a ministry like the Ministry of Mines that is at the center, but you have other ministries that do need to play a critical role. And some of them might even be the Ministry of Lands, it might be the Ministry of Agriculture, that are far off from the conversation. But in a meeting like this, you are talking about exploiting opportunities in the agriculture sector. And if you look at the list, you might not even have people that are coming through from the Ministry of Agriculture following through some of these conversations. So those are some of the things that we might need to be doing, but also investing in research and development. We have institutions like the Copperbelt University, the University of Zambia, that has been training human resource for a long time. But if you look at the extent to which we are making good use of our institutions, even in the process of undertaking initiatives such as the geological surveys that are going on, in many cases, you hardly see the local experts getting involved. And at the end of the day, you still come back and start indicating that we do not have the human resource that can drive this agenda. If we want to set up the EV manufacturing plants, we do not have the capacity to run that. But whichever country that you would go to that has developed or set up industries, they always had inadequacies, or they didn't have the full capacity, and that capacity has to be built. And if it is identified, then we need to come up with strategies that could work towards addressing some of those. And we should also be very clear and deliberate, even the way we structure our budgets. If at all the energy transition means anything, if at all the opportunities that are coming, let it also be reflected in the way we organize our budget in terms of how we would want to invest, to an extent that it should be seen that we are looking at the mining sector as a strategic sector. As we are offering incentives to improve the sector, we should also be looking at the extent to which we'll be benefiting as a people, because the energy transition just has a window. Ultimately, alternatives might be found beyond the strategic minerals like copper being highly sought after now. And when there are alternatives, it means that the attention that is being given to countries like Zambia might also reduce. So, well, the opportunity is here. The Zambian government should also strike by ensuring that it is clear in.
Great, thank you very much, Isaac. Maybe going back to you, Charles, and following up a bit on your contributions in the last question. So how is capacity on a railway like practically negotiated for? And how can we ensure that it is inclusive of women, of youth, of SMEs? You have mentioned a few points around aggregation and linking in with the SEZs, but how do we make sure that it's not just large companies, but smaller entities can also feed in negotiating power to be able to get capacity on this railway?
Okay, thank you very much. Inclusivity, both at society level, so youth, women, disadvantaged groups, but also in terms of, let me start with sectors, because this conversation has to do a lot with the mining as a sector, primarily driving the economy of this region. How do you ensure that mining does not quickly outcompete? Because naturally it would outcompete other sectors in that corridor. So there has to be a deliberate effort by states, by government, and policy holders. And I think, it's been said here, we need a broader conversation with the other policy holders as to what then capacity do we allocate this infrastructure investment for agriculture, for instance, for value-added agricultural goods to move through that corridor. Because let alone, then minerals will quickly outcompete the other sectors. But then, as usually the case, the question is, so we open up 15% capacity to agriculture, we allocate, but then where is the capacity for 15% to fill up this rail? So that goes back to the initial conversation we had earlier. It is very incumbent about among states, and especially Zambia, to build the capacity of those sectors, whether it is agri-processing, whether it is value addition in whatever other sector that you choose as a country. Very critical that you first build that capacity. Otherwise, you'll be allocating space, and it will end up being idle space. In terms, and then that at a macro level is what would trickle down to society, meaning therefore, if you look at the social benefits that would go into that allocation, is then that would inform the allocation for youth, people with disabilities, PWDs, and women. And in some countries, for instance, Kenya, there's clear law legislation around that. So certain capacity for especially public procurements is allocated for those groups, but it has to grow indicators. Then I think the next thing is how they ensure that trade between, for instance, Angola and Zambia happens. I'd indicate earlier that at the logistics side, of course, you need one-stop border post. That is critical. Bilateral agreements for logistics are really, really critical. Yeah. If we're also going to be looking at trade between these countries originating from the agricultural value chain, then cold chain solutions, cold chain facilities, and there have clear examples across other African blocks where cold chain facilities investments have been made heavily to ensure that post-harvest losses, because we're talking about agricultural produce that goes to waste. Post-harvest losses are minimized in that supply chain. But yes, going back to capacity allocation for logistics, it is critical that you have policy holders, policy makers take a decision on how do you allocate space. That has to be driven by economics, because at the end of the day, this I see to be a very fairly expensive engagement in terms of a project. There has to be a return on investment. So I think, especially for Zambia, it is very critical that you start as a country building the capacity of your farming communities, especially in those products that could move in volumes, value-added volumes, to be able to participate in that trade. Otherwise, we'll allocate capacity, and then it will be idle capacity. Then the conversation will come back to, okay, let's pump in more minerals into this pipeline or into this and as we do that, then we'll end up back to where we started, which is extraction, because you can only hit such limits for value-added minerals. If the capacity allows you and there's demand for that capacity to be filled, then you'll end up with the same situation we are in currently, where we are pushing more raw materials into that trade route. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. Going over to you, Madalena, what role do you see for the EU and the European private sector in ensuring that the Lobito Corridor achieves this multi-sector value? What support and participation would be needed to achieve this?
Thank you. Yes, so before stating that, I have to say that the capacity of European companies to enter the mineral sector to date is still as best maybe described in definition, in the sense that we don't have in Europe a significant capacity to enter the mineral value chain in the early stages, so in exploration and extraction. So in the short term, what Europe can actually contribute to along the Lobito Corridor is in other sectors at the moment. Agriculture, energy, telecommunication, infrastructure at large, and also soft skills, capacity building and so forth. And these are some of the areas that are really mainly discussed, where Europeans have more expertise and current capacity. To do this, we are seeing increased attempts by public institutions in Europe and the private sector to somehow align with each other. So both the EU and member states have become more aware that while we do not have the same state-backed economies such as China or Gulf countries, and so public institutions cannot tell the private sector where to invest, policies and financial support can actually help improve the conditions for the private sectors to step in more comfortably in strategic countries or regions, and maybe scale up projects and so forth. So we do, well, as I mentioned, Europe has some challenges at the moment. It also has some capacities and expertise, in particular in policy and regulation and financial support for its companies. So in terms of policy and regulations, the EU and member states have a lot of experience in setting up stable markets regulatory-wise. Something that investors prefer no matter where they come from. Even the Chinese prefer a stable regulatory environment than a messy one. Europe has also significant expertise in harmonizing regulations, in procedures, create trade frameworks and so forth. That make investments more attractive. So this is something that Europe can definitely help with, and in this context of the Lobito Corridor. The other area is financial support. Large infrastructure projects like the Lobito Corridor, as was already mentioned, the economics of the corridor is currently somehow in doubt or a question to the list. These large infrastructure projects do require significant investments, risk mitigation, and there are mechanisms that the EU can help with through insurance mechanisms, guarantees, concessional financing. We see increased awareness that public money from Europe will not be sufficient to contribute meaningfully to Africans' own needs and create the conditions for the European private sector to see more African countries as interesting destinations to invest in. So the EU member states are coming up with some innovative mechanisms, financial mechanisms to support their own private sector. There is, though, still a lot to do. And one of the main things that in Europe we need to do is really greater member state engagement. While some EU countries are involved in the Lobito Corridor, broader EU-wide commitment is really necessary. We need more member states on board. We also need stronger risk mitigation tools. It's true that we see some change, but we need more guarantees, more political risk insurance, more concessional loans, and more importantly, we need to revise the risk perception when it comes to Africa. And this is critical to capital, it's critical to any sort of investment. And maybe the last point where more work is needed from the European side is to have a long-term vision. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Lobito Corridor is largely driven by posturing, anti-China posturing. We need to move beyond that. The corridor is something great, region of Africa and potentially for Europe and other international partners, but see what's beyond the minerals. We need to see industrialization opportunities, agribusiness, as was already mentioned, a large digital services to create more sustainable opportunities for African and European companies which are seeking to diversify supply chains and partners, as I mentioned at the beginning. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Madlena. So we're going to have one quick round question, and then we'll come to the audience for Q&A. So this quick round question is basically the same question to each of you. And if you could give 1 to 2 points based on your perspective, your expertise. So, there's been some mention of connecting the Lobito Corridor up to the TAZARA railway that goes up. Could you each tell me what you think about the ramifications, the opportunities, the potential that this connection could have? So Madlena, you from the geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective, Charles from the logistics, and Isaac from Zambia's economic development prospects. What could linking these two railways up mean? Any of you can start.
Sure, I can start. So the sad part is that I think we're just moving into a sort of very speculative type of narrative, in the sense that I do not believe it's something possible at the moment because of the geopolitical polarization that we are seeing, and largely the European approach to China, which is seen as a systemic rival eventually. So I think that the most important geopolitical aspect would be that if a connection were to happen between Lobito and TAZARA, it would mean that we got past this moment of great polarization, and Europe, China, the US would see opportunities in cooperating, something that is difficult at the moment. Geoeconomically, this would really transform more than projects could do Africa's connectivity landscape. It would basically mean creating really a viable east-west trade corridor across the continent, which would be great for Africa, but international partners as well. And for Europe in particular, it would be interesting to reduce a bit Europe's dependence on the Red Sea and Suez Canal Panama shipping areas, which have become extremely unstable, creating significant issues for Europeans in the last few months. And so it would be, European companies would have more entry points for investments, and actually that wouldn't benefit only the Europeans, but and the African side as well, and primarily. So these would be my considerations, geopolitical and geographically.
From a logistics and transport corridor enablement point of view, and thank you, because that is really primary and very key. And just assuming that we navigate, and this as Africa, as we navigate that challenge that she's just posed, challenge, the geopolitical challenge is really key, and that really is key. It must be addressed. But granted that as a continent, and especially as AU, the African Union, this conversation is beyond Lobito into TAZARA into Dar es Salaam logistically and economically, because if that does happen, then that will be a major shift. One of the greatest challenges of intra-Africa trade is logistics. Forget about the politics, because the people are the same. My surname is very well recognized here in Zambia. In fact, it is difficult for my surname to be recognized to be Kenyan. It's more Zambian. So the challenge we face beyond geopolitics is logistics. It takes about 40% cost. It is cheaper to deliver, and I've worked in the West African trade corridor as well. And for many years, it was cheaper to move coffee from Kenya into London and then bring it down to Lagos or Ouagadougou in West Africa, and almost impossible to have it in Kinshasa. You know, forget about the cost barriers. So that corridor we navigate as the African Union to move goods, people from the West Coast and into the East Coast, from the East Coast into the West Coast, and vice versa. So linking the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, that would be a game changer, because it will reduce the cost dramatically. Then, of course, that would also enable operationalization of the African Confidential Free Trade Area. That again has become almost theoretical, because we still import goods that could be easily manufactured out of South Africa. We import them from South Korea into Eastern Africa. Yeah, electronics, vehicles. Inter-African trade would benefit a lot from that transition. But above all, it would enable the goods and services that are and the people of Africa from the West to have a better, what can we do with each other? There's a lot of potential for trade within intra-Africa. I know, of course, because it's very attractive to trade in euros, and especially for the case of Kenya, we are very export-driven. We deliver more flour and horticultural products into Europe than they require. In fact, sometimes they even export what we deliver to them. Yes, but then, as I said, there's a huge opportunity for the West and East to trade together. And I think that corridor, if we could navigate as a people, if we could navigate the geopolitical issues around that corridor, then that would be a total game changer in terms of logistics and trade. Thank you.
Well, the conversation and answering the question on my end in terms of what the prospects for Zambia's economic development would be as a result of the development of the corridor and further investments into the TAZARA. I wouldn't say that the future looks bright simply because we are working on setting up the Lobito Corridor or the TAZARA. This is because of the nature of trade that has been going on in our country. And if you look at the way we have organized our key sectors, such as the mining sector. So if Zambia is to transform economically, and if we are to use the mining sector as that vehicle for transformation, would have to do things a lot more differently. If we have a key infrastructure project like the Lobito Corridor being constructed, and part of the driving factors is to facilitate for the exportation of raw materials, I don't think that that would create a prospect that would give you the confidence that Zambia will thrive in such a setup. So Zambia might also need to, like our colleague had mentioned just at the beginning in her remarks, it's a bit more clearer from our cooperating partners that are investing into this project in terms of what they want to counter, what they want to do, and what they're looking for. So it would also be very important for countries like DRC, Zambia, and Angola to be clear in terms of what they are looking for as they get into a partnership with the European Union and other counterparts. The same level of clarity is needed so that ultimately we can get to see the extent to which the expectations for these African countries would lead to development and would also create opportunities. We have been mining for over 100 years. Dr. Masinja, who is here, would tell you that we have been mining for over 100 years, despite us being independent maybe for only 64 years. But in the 100 years that our focus has been more around extracting raw materials and taking them out of the country for value addition and then later being imported back into the country. So we make a shift around that. It is what will create opportunities for this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists. So that is the end of the panel discussion segment. We are now going to move to a Q&A session. Just a reminder to those who are joining us online, please do enter any questions you have into the Q&A box. They are being fed through to us here, so we will include them. But in the first instance, just opening up to the floor present in the room. Are there any questions that you have for the panelists or even for each other? You know, questions on the thinking that either the Zambian or the European side has on Lobito? Would really welcome any questions. Please go ahead. There are a couple of microphones that we are moving around the room.
Good morning. My question will be directed to Madalena. You spoke about how you want to kind of dissolve the Chinese influence. How China has obviously invested a lot in terms of infrastructure. Okay. China has invested a lot in terms of infrastructure. The Lobito Corridor is under its BRI, which is Belt and Road Initiative. How does the European Union intend to match up in terms of infrastructure development for the Lobito Corridor and also ensure that the infrastructure that is being built is environmentally friendly and sustainable? And then to Mr. Mwaipopo, how best do you think government can ensure that it provides a conducive environment for investors, the private sector, to ensure that they invest into the Lobito Corridor and also ensure that our small scale entrepreneurs are able to be poised to benefit from the development of the Lobito Corridor? Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions from the room? We might take 3 at a time, so that's, yeah, can come over to Ibrahim.
Thank you very much and for the wonderful panel discussion. My question revolves around the funding to this corridor. I know the US has committed to almost $500 million that is supposed to go towards the infrastructure for this project. With the change of the administration in the US, I wonder if the Trump administration, say for instance, or maybe let me put it this way, what are the risks with regards to that change of administration? Say if the Trump administration decided that they want to take a different direction towards the funding of the Lobito Corridor. So we have already seen so far what the direction has been towards the external funding, for instance, as much as that has been foreign aid. I think I would also have to be with this. So in the case of a downscaling of this by the US, what measures has the EU put in place to ensure that they would cover up for that gap?
Great, thank you. Maybe one more question from the gentleman at the back. We will come to everyone in the second round of questions, don't worry.
Good morning, and thank you for the discussion. My name is Kesho Mandila. I'm coming from Copperbelt University, Center of Excellence for EV batteries. I think in 2022, we met in Lubumbashi with some, Unica, and some representative from Germany. I think they were coming from my invest and from my company. So my question is related to value addition and something to do with EV batteries. So what we are doing now as investors, we are doing something on value addition using minerals, critical minerals, manufacturing batteries. But my question is, what are you doing in terms of building capacity? Something similar to what Isaac said. You know, we need to do research to add value to our minerals. So is the EU, having a plan to support universities which are doing research on value addition on these critical minerals? Because the guys from Germany started something with universities, University of Lubumbashi, University of Zambia, and Copperbelt University. But it's not active now. I don't know what's happening. I want to find out if the EU has plans, on value addition vis-a-vis research with institutions to build capacity, so that we can benefit and they can benefit. For example, for the battery, EU would provide certain component of the battery, and then we provide the mineral component, the components which require the use of minerals, so that there's a win-win situation. What's happening now is Chinese are currently in Zambia, they are building EV batteries, but there's no that connections with universities. And for Chinese, they use their own transport, their own vehicle. The community are not benefiting. So what perspective are you going to take in terms of ensuring there's value addition and there's community benefit?
Okay, no, thank you very much. We do have a whole session this afternoon looking specifically at the value addition for minerals. So for this panel, I'll try and stick to the Lobito and trade corridor question, but I have no. So maybe I can open up to the panel. We have a question around whether the US funding behind the Lobito is safe, given the change in administration in the US and what the implications of that could be, as well as whether the development is being done in a sustainable manner by the EU. And also the aspect on value addition I've just benchmarked, or for now we will come back to that later. Madeleine, are you able to pick up the EU question? And I'm also happy to try on the US funding one with contributions from others.
Yeah, so I think I use the word to say how the EU is approaching this China element, which is dilute China's influence. And it's not only about the Lobito, it's globally. It's not to dissolve China, it's to dilute the presence of China in specific sectors, including in the mineral sector. This is not clear whether Europe will manage to do that. Europe has a huge dependency on China on minerals and several other sectors. So the aim is to reduce this dependency on a single actor and diversify partners. So China is not necessarily somebody that needs to be out of the picture, also because it's impossible at the moment, but to dilute a little bit its influence. And I don't think, and I invite Europeans in the room to actually also make this as interactive as possible and contribute to this if you want. But clearly we are a think tank, not from the European institutions, but I don't think it is about matching up China. It is about reinserting Europe in the large infrastructure space in Africa, and where the Europeans have been largely absent over the last couple of decades. So I don't think it's about matching up. It's about more signaling that the Europeans are back into cross-regional infrastructure projects that need lots of funding, that need lots of people around. I mentioned the multi-stakeholder approach. So setting a slightly different paradigm, which is not only development oriented, but it actually includes the private sector. So public-private partnerships and developing with Africa, seeing Africa as the African countries as markets for European companies and not only places where to roll out development cooperation. And in terms of environmentally friendly approach, I think this is a sort of the ABC of the European approach. There are stringent requirements, and sometimes these requirements are even contrary to the economics of projects, because fulfilling ESG standards does carry costs. But it's at the forefront of the European approach. So I think that in terms of environmentally friendly projects, it's part of the game. It's no doubt it's going to be part of the game. And maybe if I can just briefly say something on the US from the consultations that we have had in recent weeks, it seems that the interest in the Lobito corridor specifically is still pretty high, and it might be linked to the fact that it's a strong anti-China sort of approach, especially for the US, but it's also linked to the minerals side of things, which, as I tried to explain, is slightly different from the European approach. So we don't see at the moment a pull out from the US in this space, but I think that if that were to happen, European member states would still likely continue to develop this project.
Great, thank you very much, Madalena. And we also have a question that's very similar on the funding aspect that's coming online. Looking at how much funding the EU has put into the Lobito. So my understanding is that the concession is held by 3 European countries, but there isn't necessarily EU public funding behind that. But I would like to open this to the Europeans present to just clarify on the funding aspect, if you're able to share any information. Okay, I'm not sure if anyone present wants to respond to that. It's a point we're not sure of, so we're really looking for feedback from the EU or member states on this, whether you know if there is public EU funding behind Lobito. Okay, and then okay.
Diego De Agostini, I'm the Italian ambassador. Well, as we understand it, the European Union, in the context of the Global Gateway, is pledging 250 million euros. Italy has also pledged 300 million euros. How these funds will materialize is a question mark. Of course, there has to be the involvement of European entrepreneurs, enterprises. I see that personally as one of the biggest challenges for the development of this region, that I don't really see a great engagement on the side of Europe. I see the Italian side, obviously. I don't really see a great interest in investing in this region, clearly because the perception of this region is still not that of a, yes, there are opportunities, but the risks are too great and the regulatory framework is extremely murky. Crossing borders, somebody mentioned that yesterday. I crossed it day before yesterday. I went to Zimbabwe and came back. And I used to live in Zimbabwe, now live in Zambia, and the rules have changed and they've become more cumbersome than 10 years ago. It took me an hour and a half to cross one border as a private citizen with a diplomatic number plate on my car. So it is no wonder that a lot of European potential investors are not really convinced that the opportunities that they recognize will then materialize in gains. And that is something we have to, of course, work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. So for the record, both EU but also member state pledges made behind the Lobito Corridor. And as Madalena said, it seems that this would be safe regardless of what the US decision is. So far in the US, we've seen decisions affect US aid, but not the US DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. So far, we haven't seen any comments being made that would indicate that the Trump administration would be withdrawing mineral pledges in Africa. It's obviously a rapidly evolving. So far, it seems to not be in the crosshairs. Maybe I can open up for more questions. I have one more that's coming in from online. What is the likelihood of the Zambian government playing a central role in facilitating China-EU dialogue, while also integrating new actors such as the Gulf states in infrastructure development to avoid duplication and ensure efficiency? So this is the first of the next round of questions. Are there any other questions? Yes, the lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Shemba Mlambia from the University of Zambia. Question is probably directed to all the panelists. Looking at construction has been probably in the past 60 years in Zambia. It has from a human development point of view. And probably this has been largely due to the imbalance of relationships between the central government and the local communities. So I would be interested, if the European Union has to come in, what would they do differently to ensure that there is that balance in relating to local communities? Because local communities where resource extraction is happening, that's where you find probably the most poorest communities there and highest of disease burden. And let's talk about access to opportunities, resources. It's non-existent, so to say, in those communities. So what would you do differently? And speaking about agriculture, if you're saying that mining, trade would actually bring in something very different for the agriculture sector. For the agriculture sector as well, I think with local communities, they don't benefit as well. I think when we're talking about cooperatives, making cooperatives, I think that has not worked so well in that. So how do you foster to ensure that even the smallest initiatives in communities are recognized and maybe the national level, at the global level? So thank you.
Okay, so we have possibly only one more question in this round. Maybe I can go to Duet.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity and the good and important discussion. The question is on dealing with the practical side. Activities already ongoing in that area. That's very good. Benefits from agriculture already in that corridor. I see opportunities around, for example, at the opportunities already there. People are delivering from all over Zambia to that side, pigs, etc. I mean, oats, and other services. Logistics. Would sweeten problems. Doesn't matter whether you have 10, 20, or 30 corridors, you still have a problem. What are we doing? The issues that need to be dealt with to advantage of what we have.
Okay, no, thank you. I will come up for another round. Just to, before I hand over to the panel, the aspect around what the EU might do differently. We know that under the, and this is also a comment that's coming in from the EU ambassador to Zambia, just to reiterate the EU's commitment to adhering to ESG standards and also to community beneficiation in their approach. So this really is embedded in the strategic partnerships that the EU has with Zambia. So I can't go into the details of how exactly it would be approached differently, but we do know that these principles are extremely important to EU actors and that would be embedded in the approach. But I can hand over to the panelists. We have some questions. Maybe over to you, Isaac, the existing opportunities that are there and what more could be done to really maximize that aspect. And we also have the question around what the Zambian government could be doing to try and facilitate the contributions of different development partners and investors. So EU, China, but also to integrate the Gulf and others. And I think most of the questions are for you in this round, Isaac.
So with regards to how the Zambian government can leverage on this opportunity and facilitate for opportunities for the private sector that had come through in the first round of questions, I think what we might need to do as a country is to actualize the potential that we have identified for a long time in almost all the development policies, be it Vision 2030, be it Vision. We have identified the agriculture sector as one of the key sectors. We have the tourism sector. But beyond that, we need to demonstrate our commitment towards opening up opportunities and supporting the key players that can help to tap into those opportunities. But it also goes back to addressing some of the key challenges that the key private sector players might be facing within our country in terms of tapping into those opportunities. We have long-standing challenges such as access to affordable finance that they can invest into ventures. Equally of importance is to look at why have the multi-facility economic zones failed to take off? We have been singing about multi-facility economic zones, but some of the key questions we should be asking: what exactly is coming out of the multi-facility economic zones? Where is it going to? What are the volumes of products that are coming out of the multi-facility economic zones that we can leverage on to participate in this opportunity that is coming up? It is one thing to just continue setting up multi-facility economic zones, but we should also look at how our policy framework is structured. I think a survey that we did with Emmanuel a few years ago, looking at the performance of the multi-facility economic zones, we did find that most of them have actually failed to take off due to a number of reasons. But one of the big reasons was speaking to the issue of policy inconsistencies. When we conducted that survey, we found out that within a period of 5 years, the government that was in power then had close to 4 ministers of finance, and each minister of finance that was coming in was introducing different regulations, different tax laws. And it was around that time that we were also having a big debate around sales tax. It was around that time that we had, within a period, we had Alexander Chikwanda, we had Felix Mtati, we had Margaret Mwanakatwe, Margaret Mwanakatwe, within a period of 4 years of a party being in office. So those are some of the things that actually need to be addressing so that ultimately there's consistency in what we are doing. Maybe allow me to just add further to the question that Ibrahim had asked with regards to financing, which is a question that I'm asking to the African governments. It's clear in terms of what the US is committing to contribute. The figures have also been mentioned in terms of potentially what the European Union is thinking of contributing. But with us, what is our contribution? So if we think that the Lobito Corridor would be of benefit to us, what are we contributing? What are we adding to the table? If it is important to us, why are we not being clear in terms of what our commitment would be? It also applies to the question with regards to financing, capacity building. I think the approach should not entirely be that others should be the ones that should come to always build our capacity. With all the building that has been taking place on the continent, where are we taking all that capacity? Because we keep attending workshops, we keep going to countries for capacity building, we keep sending staff for capacity building. Where does all that go? Even as we look at our universities, before we look to the European Union, what is it that we are doing within our countries to also allocate our own resources so that the Copperbelt University, the University of Zambia, can be in a position to advance our participation in the EV value chain? I do think that besides the external approach, we also need to start having a bigger conversation of what we are doing. It might even be in a small way, but ultimately there should be a place where others can build on, unlike this overdependence on our external cooperating partners to do everything for us.
In regard to two questions that have been posed there, and just in addition to what my colleagues have said here, in relation to my friend there and your conversation around what can be done at micro level, even before we start talking about the big things that Lobito and other corridors will open. Very great observation there. And I think, and especially for the agriculture value chain, and with practical experience from another part of Africa, Eastern Africa corridor, that must happen, because if you are unable to trade with your neighbors and you cannot add value across borders, then it is very unlikely for you to add value across the Atlantic. And for piloting of agricultural value chains, I think inter-regional, intra-Africa trade just within your neighborhoods would be a perfect place to start. But then how does it happen if a diplomat of the level of the Italian ambassador is spending 2 hours at a border, crossing a regional border. How about the locals? I can imagine what you go through a whole day. Wow. So I think at SADC, at interregional level, that really must be addressed. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to have to learn from very far. You have neighboring trading blocks that have overcome that challenge. And for sure, we experienced that just 10, 15 years ago between Kenya, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. That was commonplace. And if that's our individuals, how about the truck that is carrying a 40-foot container of goods that is going across those borders? Those drivers will spend, and of course that adds to the cost. And therefore, like he said rightfully, if you have such dark patches within your trading activities, how do you expect the EU, someone from out there really, to invest their millions of dollars to unlock your value to be able to supply to them? They cannot foresee that. And so that but again, if we expand the conversation to the right actors, then those issues must be dealt with. But yes, without going to the details of how it can be done, it is very possible, and in fact very easy in terms of trade facilitation. So one-stop border post, what needs to be entered, even before we get into a political union, there has to be a way of national IDs or passports being entered into a system that can become possible for you to move around the countries without all those challenges. Because if it is that difficult for human beings, then for trade, that is goods, it's really impossible. So that has to be dealt with. Now, going back then to the question around how to make agricultural value chains start feeding into trade, and especially small-scale holder farmers. You mentioned about cooperative societies with a lot of experience with dealing with what we call SACCOs, that side, savings and credit societies. So it has to do a lot with government policy. Government really has to be involved in that, because remember, before you start building the cooperative societies, you have to start with the farmers. So subsidies, and I hear subsidies, things like fertilizer subsidies, though they look very attractive, they are very ineffective if they're not supported with proper capacity building of those farmers. Half of the farmers who receive those kind of subsidies end up selling to the next guy who has the capacity, because they don't have capacity even to figure out what to do with this. It's pretty much what happened across the border in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago. So the capacity of local farming communities has to be, and therefore as bilateral partners, EU, if you're going to look at, for instance, the value chain of agricultural products, it's very important you start investing in capacity building for those products. And speaking with experience, for instance, with macadamia and avocado value chains in Kenya, where they became so developed that today the conversation is not about China or EU or the US. The product is so good that the trading partners, the product is trade agnostic. So you actually have to compete to come and pick it up from Kenya. So that capacity of the local value chain actors have to be built to such a level that over the years, then it doesn't become a conversation around whether it's Chinese or Europe or the Americas who are going to be our customers. If at our products, our goods and services are so superior, then that in terms of trade partners, they are agnostic. So capacity building is really key before you even get into SACCOs. And therefore, the farming communities that will benefit from this then have to be aggregated into societies, so that you also do not start dealing with the micro level. You have at some level of aggregation. And I think earlier I mentioned about aggregation centers. Aggregation centers are logistics facilities for trade. And but before you get to aggregation, you must really build capacity at this level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. We're actually at time for this panel. The panelists will be available for a quick couple of follow-up questions over coffee. So those that I did not manage to get to your questions, I apologize. Please do try and catch the panelists outside if you have some burning questions. But I just want to give a very big thank you to the panel for sharing their insight. We will be coming back to the coffee break for the next session. So please do have a quick break, get some coffee, and a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you.